The wind on the high plains doesn't just whistle, it screams. For Matilda Grant, it was a constant reminder of her new cage. Snatched from a life of modest comfort, she was now the property of a man spoken of only in whispers. Caelan Blackwater. They called him a chief, a shadow, a brute. He was the cold, scarred man who owned the vast, unwelcoming Blackwater Divide, and now he owned her. She was forced to work for him to pay a debt that wasn't hers, trapped in his silent, dark ranch house, where every creak of the floorboards felt like a threat. The day her life ended and her servitude began, it smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool. Matilda Grant sat on a hard-backed chair in what was left of her father's study, the room stripped bare by creditors. Her father, Walter Grant, a man of grand ideas and thin ledgers, had passed 2 weeks prior, leaving behind a mountain of debts and one final terrible secret. The man sitting opposite her, Lars Donovan, was the physical embodiment of that secret. He was a broad, grizzled man, his face a map of sun-scoured lines, and his eyes held a flat, merciless quality. He worked for Caelan Blackwater. "Your father, miss, was a gambler in all things," Donovan said, his voice a low rumble. He tapped a sheaf of papers on the bare mahogany desk. "He wagered on mines that didn't exist and railroads that wouldn't be built, and then he made a final wager with Mr. Blackwater." Matilda's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap, her nails left half-moon indents in her palms. "I have no money. You've taken the house. You've taken everything." "Not everything," Donovan said, and he pushed one paper across the desk. It wasn't a loan document. It was a contract of indenture. "Your father signed this 3 months ago, collateral in case his ship didn't come in." She read the terms, her blood turning to ice. "In the event of default, my daughter Matilda L. Grant shall provide 5 years of service to Caelan Blackwater in any capacity deemed appropriate. This is slavery," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. "It's a debt," Donovan corrected, standing. "And Mr. Blackwater always collects. Pack a bag. 1 bag." The journey west was a blur of dust, rattling wagon wheels, and cold, indifferent nights. Donovan and his men spoke little, treating her not as a person, but as cargo. They traveled for weeks, leaving the green hills of the east for a harsh, red rock country that felt like the surface of another world. They climbed higher into the high plains of the Arizona Territory, a place of stark, brutal beauty. The Blackwater Divide was not a ranch. It was a fortress. It sat in a massive, wind-scarred basin, protected on 3 sides by towering mesas. The ranch house itself was not the grand estate she might have imagined, but a long, low-slung building of dark timber and riverstone, solid and menacing. It looked as though it had been carved from the landscape itself. Donovan shoved her through the heavy oak door into a great room. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and old leather. A fire crackled in a cavernous stone fireplace, but it offered no warmth, only shadows. And in those shadows, a man stood. He was taller than Donovan, leaner, but with a presence that filled the entire room. He was still utterly still, watching her. He wore simple dark trousers and a linen shirt, but the authority radiating from him was more potent than any suit. His hair was black, pulled back tightly, and his face was a mask of hard angles and striking, unreadable features, a clear testament to his Apache heritage. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, assessing, and utterly terrifyingly cold. A long silver-white scar cut from his left temple down to his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. This was Caelan Blackwater. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, a long, dissecting gaze that stripped her bare. Matilda felt a tremor of pure fear. This was the man who now owned her. Donovan broke the silence. "Boss, this is the Grant girl. The debt." Kaelin Blackwater's gaze flickered to Donovan, a look so sharp it was like a physical blow. Donovan actually took a half step back. Kaelin's voice, when he finally spoke, was not a boom, but a low, quiet sound that cut through the room like a razor. "I am aware of the debt, Donovan. Take her to the East Room. Mrs. Price will give her work." He didn't look at Matilda again. He turned back to the fire, dismissing her, as one would dismiss a servant. Donovan grabbed her arm. "You heard him." The room she was given was small, clean, and cold. A simple bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a barren courtyard. A stout, grey-haired woman, Mrs. Price, the cook and housekeeper, came in later. She was stern, but not unkind. "You'll work, Mrs. Price said, her voice clipped. "Mr. Blackwater doesn't tolerate idleness. You'll be in the kitchens before dawn. And a word of advice, girl. Stay out of his way. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look him in the eye. Just do your work, and you might just survive this place." Matilda sat on the hard mattress, the sounds of the alien ranch filtering in the distant lowing of cattle, the shouts of men, the constant lonely scream of the wind. She had not been forced into slavery. She had been delivered to a ghost in a land of ghosts. And the coldest of them all was her new master. Matilda's hands, once accustomed to the gentle touch of piano keys and paintbrush bristles, were raw and red within a week. The work was brutal. She was up before the sun hauling water, scrubbing floors, peeling potatoes for Mrs. Price, and washing the heavy coarse linens for the dozens of men who worked the Blackwater Divide. She learned the ranch's rhythm through sheer exhausting repetition. It was a self-contained empire. Kaelin Blackwater owned the land, the cattle, the small copper mine in the northern hills, and the loyalty of the hard men he employed. He was a silent king, ruling his domain with an iron, unspoken will. Matilda followed Mrs. Price's advice. She kept her head down. She avoided Kaelin. In her first 2 weeks, she saw him only 3 times, always at a distance. He moved like a shadow across the compound, his presence a palpable weight. The men feared him. They didn't dare cross him. One afternoon, she saw why. A ranch hand. A new man named Peters was caught skimming money from the supply wagon accounts. Lars Donovan dragged him into the main courtyard. Kaelin Blackwater emerged from the main house. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood before Peters, who was shaking. "You stole from me," Kaelin stated. "It wasn't a question." "Boss, please, it was just a few dollars." "You stole from the men you work with. You stole medicine and food." Kaelin looked at Donovan. "Tie him to the post, 20 lashes. Then give him a canteen and point him south. If he's seen on my land again, shoot him." Matilda, watching from the kitchen window, felt sick. The brutal, rhythmic crack of the whip echoed across the basin. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a cold, hard justice as unforgiving as the land itself. Her status changed a month into her servitude. Kaelin Blackwater was in the ranch office, a room she had never been allowed to enter, arguing with Donovan. Matilda was sweeping the hall outside her head, down trying to be invisible. "It's a mess, boss." Donovan's voice was raised in frustration. "These ledgers from the mine, they don't add up. That agent in Redemption Creek Holt, he's cheating us, I know it, but I can't prove it. It's just numbers and they make my head spin." "Then unspin it," Kaelin's low voice replied. "I'm a foreman. Cale, not a damned accountant. Ever since your last man ran off." There was a tense silence. Matilda held her breath. Kaelin's voice came again, closer. "You." Matilda froze. He was standing in the doorway, blocking the light. She slowly looked up, her heart hammering. It was the first time he had addressed her directly since her arrival. "You can read?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "You can write do-figures." "Yes, sir. My father. He had me educated. I managed his ledgers." Caelan stared at her, his dark eyes intense, as if he were trying to see the truth of her words etched on her skin. He gave a curt nod. "You're done in the kitchen. Donovan, get her cleaned up. She works in here now, at dawn." He stepped back into the office and shut the door. The next day, Matilda's life changed again. She was no longer scrubbing floors. She was sitting at a heavy oak desk in Caelan Blackwater's office, a room that smelled of cured tobacco, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of sage that seemed to cling to Caelan himself. For the first week, he said almost nothing to her. He would simply place a stack of ledgers on her desk in the morning and leave. She was to balance the accounts for the ranch, the mine, and the trading post he ran. The work was complex. Her father's ledgers had been child's play. This was an operation vast and tangled with agents in far-off cities. And Donovan was right, the numbers were a mess. She found discrepancies everywhere. There were phantom supply shipments, payments for ghost workers at the mine, and consistently low prices on cattle sold through one specific agent, Deputy Gideon Holt of the nearby town Redemption Creek. She worked meticulously, the crisp scratch of her pen nib, the only sound in the room, for hours. Caelan would sit at his own massive desk, not reading, not writing, but simply staring into the fire, lost in a place she couldn't imagine. Sometimes he would just watch her. She would feel the weight of his gaze, but when she'd hazard a glance, his expression was unreadable, carved from stone. He was a puzzle. He ran a massive, complex enterprise, yet she never saw him read a report or write a letter. He would have her read documents aloud, then give his verbal reply, which she would then draft into a letter. Was he illiterate? The thought seemed impossible for a man of his clear intelligence. One evening she worked late, trying to trace a missing payroll. The rest of the house was silent. Caelan was at his desk, the firelight catching the silver of his scar. A gust of wind rattled the window, and a stray ember leaped from the fireplace, landing on a stack of papers near the hearth. Before Matilda could even stand, Caelan moved. He was not a shadow. He was lightning. He crossed the room in 2 strides and smothered the ember with his bare hand. "Sir." Matilda gasped, jumping up. He stood his back to her, his hand clenched into a fist. He hadn't flinched. "You're hurt," she said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Let me see." "It's nothing." He bit out his voice, rougher than usual. "Please the fire. I have some salve in my room." He turned on her, his face a mask of sudden cold fury. "Do your work, girl, and do not ever mistake your position here. You are a tool, a ledger, nothing more." The word struck her like a slap. Humiliation and anger warred with her fear. She dropped her gaze, her cheeks burning. "Yes, sir." She returned to her desk, her hands shaking. She hated him. She hated his coldness, his power, his ranch. But as she sat there pretending to work, she saw him, when he thought she wasn't looking, flex his burned hand, his face tight with a pain he would never admit to. He was a man locked inside himself, and for the first time, she didn't just feel fear. She felt a sliver of profound and unwanted pity. The dynamic in the office grew stranger. Caelan remained distant to the cold master, yet he began to rely on her for more than just accounts. He had her read to him from newspapers that arrived, his face expressionless, as she detailed political squabbles in Washington or new tariffs. He was absorbing, analyzing, calculating. Matilda, in turn, began to see the man behind the ledger. She saw the graft he was fighting. She saw that Deputy Gideon Holt was systematically robbing him, using his position as a lawman to manipulate shipping manifests and skim profits. She presented her findings to Caelan one morning, laying out the balanced books next to the fraudulent ones. "He's stolen nearly $10,000, Mr. Blackwater," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He's using a false company name to bill you for services never rendered at the mine." Caelan studied the numbers, his dark eyes missing nothing. He was silent for a full minute. "You are certain of this?" "Yes, sir. The figures don't lie." He looked at her and his gaze was different. It was not cold, it was sharp, assessing. "Good. You have done well. Do not speak of this to anyone. Not Donovan. Not Mrs. Price." It was the first time he had ever offered her a word of praise. It warmed her more than the fireplace ever could. A new unspoken trust began to form. He was still her master, she his indentured servant. But in the confines of that office, they were something else, allies. He was the strategist. She was his scribe. The true crack in his icy facade came not from business, but from a book. Matilda, tasked with organizing the chaotic mess of his office, was sorting through a chest of old documents. Beneath a stack of territorial maps, she found a small leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with time. She opened it. It was not a ledger. It was poetry. John Keats. She stared at the pages, stunned. The book was filled with elegant, precise handwriting. But it wasn't Caelan's. The script was feminine, and in the front, an inscription, "To my Caelan, may you always find beauty in the words." Elot. She was still holding it when Caelan returned. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes locking on the book in her hands. The atmosphere in the room plunged into a dangerous cold. "Put that down," he said, his voice a lethal whisper. Matilda flinched and placed the book on the desk as if it were burning her. "I'm sorry, I was just organizing. I told you," he snarled, advancing on her, "that you were a tool. You do not touch my things. You do not pry into my life. Is that understood?" His rage was a physical force, a wall of heat and fury. It was more terrifying than his coldness because it was alive. She had crossed a line she hadn't known existed. "Yes, sir," she whispered, backing away until her legs hit the chair. "Get out," he commanded. "Mr. Blackwater." "I said get out," he roared, sweeping a stack of papers from his desk. Matilda fled. She ran to her small, cold room and locked the door, her heart pounding. She had undone everything. She had reminded him that she was a prying, untrustworthy outsider. She didn't see him for 2 days. She was banished from the office, sent back to the kitchens. Mrs. Price gave her a pitying look but said nothing. The defeat was bitter. The office, with its numbers and its quiet tension, had been a refuge. The kitchen was just labor. On the 3rd day, Donovan found her. "Boss wants you." She walked to the office, her stomach in knots, expecting to be punished to be sent away, or worse. She found Caelan standing by the window, looking out at the rugged mesas. The poetry book was on his desk. He didn't turn around. "The book," he said, his voice flat. "It was my mother's." Matilda said nothing, afraid to break the fragile truce. "She was Apache." He continued, his voice so low she had to strain to hear. "But she was educated in a mission school. She loved their words, their poetry. She taught me to read from that book." The confession hung in the air. He could read. All this time he wasn't illiterate. He was something else. Testing her, or perhaps, as she suspected, with the newspapers he preferred to listen to, watch people's faces as they spoke to gather more information than words alone provided. She must have been a wonderful woman. Matilda offered her voice, trembling slightly. Caelan turned. His face was unreadable, but the fury was gone. The coldness was back, but it felt different, thinner, more brittle. "She is dead," he said. "She was killed. By men like your father. Men who came west with soft hands and greedy hearts, taking what wasn't theirs." The accusation stung, but Matilda met his gaze. "My father was a fool, Mr. Blackwater. He was not a killer." A flicker of something surprise respect passed through his eyes. "He signed you away, girl. It's the same thing." He motioned to her desk. "You will resume your work, and you will forget what you saw." She nodded, walking back to her seat, her mind reeling. He had let her in. Just a fraction, just a sliver of the man beneath the scars. But it was there. He had shown her a piece of his pain. The work resumed. But now, when she read to him, she understood. He wasn't just listening to the news. He was listening for the lies. And when he stared into the fire, she knew he wasn't just thinking about cattle. He was thinking about a woman who loved poetry and the fire that had taken her away. The thaw having begun was slow but undeniable. Calen Blackwater did not become kind, but he became present. He spoke to her not just in commands, but in quiet queries. He asked her opinion on the tone of a letter, on the suspected motives of a supplier. He began to treat her less like a tool and more like a confidant. A very, very wary confidant. Matilda, for her part, lost her sharpest fear. It was replaced by a deep, complex curiosity. She saw the contradictions in him. He was a chief to his Apache workers, a boss to the White Hands, and a savage to the people in town. He was a ruthless businessman who left grain for the wild horses in winter. He was a man of intense, controlled violence who had a book of Keats hidden in his desk. The real shift happened not in the office but in the dust of the main compound. A young ranch hand, Ben, barely 18, had been tasked with breaking a wild stallion. The horse, a furious creature of muscle and panic, had thrown him, stomped, and then crushed Ben's leg against a fence post. Matilda heard the scream from the office window. By the time she got outside, a crowd of hands had gathered. Ben was on the ground, pale and sweating, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The bone was clearly visible. Lars Donovan stood over him, scowling. "Stupid kid. No business being on that horse. Someone get him a bottle of whiskey and drag him to his bunk. He's done." "He'll lose the leg," Matilda said, pushing through the circle of men. The sight was horrific, but she felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. "Or he'll die of fever," Donovan spat. "And what do you know, Ledger girl? I know it needs to be cleaned and set. Mrs. Price, get me the strongest whiskey you have, boiling water, and clean strips of linen. Now." Mrs. Price, seeing the authority in Matilda's face, hurried off. "You'll do no such thing," Donovan growled, grabbing her arm. "You'll kill him. Let her go, Lars." Calen Blackwater's voice cut through the commotion. He had come from the stables, and he was watching Matilda, his dark eyes narrowed. Donovan released her arm. "Boss, she's a paper pusher. She'll make it worse." "She will try," Calen said. "Which is more than you are doing. Get back to your work, all of you." The crowd dispersed, leaving only Matilda Calen and the groaning young man on the ground. Mrs. Price returned with the supplies. For the next hour, Matilda worked. She poured whiskey onto the wound, cleaning it of dirt and grit, ignoring Ben's choked cries. She forced herself to look at the injury, with a clinical detachment, remembering a medical text her father had once owned. Calen never left. He stood a few feet away, a silent sentinel. When it came time to set the bone, Ben was delirious. "I need you to hold him," Matilda said to Calen, not looking up. "He cannot move." Calen knelt on the other side of the young man. "Hold on, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He placed his large, strong hands on Ben's shoulders, holding him steady. Matilda took a deep breath. "On 3. 1, 2. She pulled hard. There was a sickening wet pop and Ben screamed, then passed out. Matilda, shaking, began to bind the leg with splints. Her hands were covered in blood. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her trembling. "He will be moved to the main house," Kalen said, his voice quiet. He lifted the young man as if he weighed nothing and carried him inside, placing him in a guest room near the kitchen. Later that night, Matilda sat by Ben's bed, bathing his head with a cool cloth. He was feverish, but his breathing was steady. The door creaked. Kalen stood there holding something. It was a small, dark wooden box. He placed it on the table. "My mother was a healer," he said. He opened the box. Inside were dried herbs, powders, and salves. "This is yarrow, for the fever. This," he pointed to a dark green paste, "is for the wound. It will stop the poison." He showed her how to mix them. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. "You knew what to do," Matilda said, her voice full of awe. "Why did you let me?" "Because they needed to see you do it," he replied, his gaze distant. "Donovan respects only strength. The men, they see you as a toy, an outsider. Now they see you as something else." He looked at his own hands covered in the herbs. "She taught me this. She said there were 2 languages, the language of taking and the language of mending. She was a mender." Matilda looked at the prominent scar on his face, silver in the lamplight. "And what language did the men who gave you that scar speak?" The question was too bold. She regretted it instantly. He went still. His hand instinctively went to the scar on his jaw. "The language of fire," he said, his voice hollow. "They were soldiers. They came to pacify the territory. They burned our winter camp. They said we had raided a settlement." "Had you?" she whispered. "No. Prospectors had. But we were an easier target." He touched his face. "I was a boy. I tried to pull my sister from our lodge. The roof, it fell in. I woke up on the riverbank. My mother was gone. My sister was gone. This," he said, touching the scar, "is all they left me of my family." He stood abruptly. "He will live." "You did well, Matilda." He left the room, leaving her alone with the sleeping boy and the story of his past, a story written in fire and scars. He had called her by her name. Not girl, not you, Matilda. The debt, the indenture, the office, all of it faded. In that moment, she just saw a man. A man who had been burned to the ground and had somehow impossibly rebuilt himself from the ashes. Young Ben survived. The fever broke, and thanks to Kalen's remedies and Matilda's care, the leg began to heal, crooked but functional. The incident changed everything. The ranch hands who had once looked at her with suspicion or crude interest now tipped their hats. "Mom," they called her. Donovan still watched her with his flat, cold eyes, but his contempt was now tinged with a reluctant respect. The biggest change, however, was in Kalen. The barrier between them was still there, but it was no longer a wall of ice. It was a curtain, and sometimes he would pull it back. He began to teach her, not just about ledgers, but about the land. He took her riding, showing her the boundaries of his territory, the high pastures where the cattle grazed, the secret spring that fed the ranch. He taught her the Apache names for the mesas and the plants. He spoke of the balance of the land, the way the hawk and the snake, the drought and the flood were all part of a whole. He was still a hard man. He was still quiet. But his silence was no longer empty and cold. It was full. This new trust was put to the test when Kalen needed to send a large bank draft to Santa Fe. It was the payroll for the real miners, not the ghosts on Holt's ledger. "I cannot go," Kalen said. "Holt is watching me. He expects me to move this money. Donovan is too noticeable. They will have to go to Redemption Creek, and you will have to be the one to do it. Matilda's heart leaped into her throat. Me. You. You are just the ledger girl. No one would suspect you of carrying a draft for $50,000. You will go with Donovan. He will guard you. But you will go to the bank. You will go to the telegraph office. You will not let that draft out of your sight. Redemption Creek was a raw, bustling town carved into the dust. It was one street of false-fronted buildings, saloons and supply stores, teeming with rough-looking miners, soldiers and cowboys. Donovan left her at the mouth of the street. Bank's at the end. Telegraph is next to it. I'll be at the saloon across the way. Do not be long. Matilda, clutching her satchel, walked down the boardwalk, feeling the eyes of every man on her. She felt exposed, a pale, lone woman in a sea of grizzled masculinity. She made it to the bank and handed the draft to the teller. As she waited for the confirmation receipt, a shadow fell over her. Well now, this is a surprise. She turned. Deputy Gideon Holt stood there, his badge gleaming on his vest. He was a handsome man, in a polished, predatory way, with a thick mustache and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He was the man Kalen had warned her about. The snake. I didn't realize Mr. Blackwater let his help come to town, Holt said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He looked at the bank teller, then back at her. Running important errands, are we? Just posting a letter. Deputy, Matilda lied, her voice steady. A letter? Holt chuckled. That's a mighty official-looking satchel for just a letter. He leaned closer. You know, miss, a woman like you. You don't belong out there on the divide. It's a dangerous place. That man, he's a savage. You look terrified. I am perfectly safe, thank you. Are you? Holt's voice dropped. He's a hard man, Kalen Blackwater. Half-breed with a chip on his shoulder, the size of a mountain. But he has land. Land that the territory needs. Land he refuses to part with. He's an obstacle. The bank teller returned with her receipt. Matilda snatched it. He's also holding you against your will, isn't he? Holt said, blocking her path. An indenture. I've seen the paperwork. It's illegal, you know. Barbaric. Matilda stared at him. What do you want, deputy? I want to help you. He smiled again, all teeth. You're in that office all day. You see his books. You know his weaknesses. Where he keeps his cash, who his partners are. Information, Miss Grant. You provide me with some information, and I can have that indenture contract burned. I can have you on a stagecoach back east by the end of the week. Free. It was the offer she had dreamed of for months. Freedom. Home. She looked into Gideon Holt's pale reptilian eyes. She thought of her father, a man of grand ideas, who sold his own daughter. She thought of Kalen, a man who had lost everything, who carried the scars of a massacre, who taught her the names of the stars in his own language. She saw the snake clearly. I'm afraid I can't help you. Deputy, Matilda said, her voice clear and cold. Mr. Blackwater's books are perfectly balanced. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get to the telegraph office. She pushed past him. His face darkened, the charming mask dropping. You're making a mistake, girl, he hissed. You side with him, you'll burn with him. She didn't look back. She sent the telegraph, her hands shaking, and met Donovan at the wagon. The ride back to the Blackwater Divide was long and silent. When they arrived, Kalen was waiting for them on the porch of the main house, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. It's done, Matilda said, handing him the receipts. You saw Holt, he stated. Yes. She took a deep breath. He knows about the indenture. He offered me my freedom. He wanted me to spy on you. He wanted to know your weaknesses. Donovan went still. Kalen's face remained impassive, but his eyes, His eyes burned. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him your books were balanced," Matilda said, meeting his gaze. "I told him I couldn't help him. And he said, if I sided with you, I would burn with you." Kaelin Blackwater stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. The wind howled through the basin, pulling at her hair. He had bought her. He owned her. And she had just in front of his foreman chosen him the savage, the half-breed, the cold master over her own freedom. He gave a single curt nod. "Go inside, Matilda. Mrs. Price has dinner for you." As she walked past him, he spoke one more word, so low she almost missed it. "Donovan, double the watch on the North Ridge. Holt's getting desperate. He'll make his move soon." She went inside, the power of her choice settling over her. She hadn't just proven her loyalty. She had declared her allegiance. She was no longer just a servant on the Blackwater Divide. She was part of it. The ranch braced for a storm. Kaelin moved with a new, quiet urgency, redeploying his men, securing the cattle in the high basin, and stockpiling supplies. The quiet, unspoken alliance between him and Matilda solidified into a true partnership. She was no longer just his scribe. She was his counsel. They spent long nights in the office, Kaelin pacing before the fire, outlining his plans, and Matilda listening, questioning and recording. He trusted her. He trusted her mind, her judgment, and her loyalty. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, she barely remembered the terrified woman who had arrived months before. One night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows, Kaelin paused in his pacing. He was staring at the small burnt toy, a small wooden horse that he kept on the mantel. Matilda had seen it before, but had never dared to ask. "He's not just after the land," Kaelin said, his back to her. "He's after me. Holt. Gideon Holt. He picked up the toy horse. I told you soldiers burned my camp. Holt was with them. He wasn't a deputy then. He was a scout. The man who found the hostile camp." Matilda's blood ran cold. "He led them to you." "He did more than that," Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with a decades-old pain. "He was working for the prospectors who wanted our land. My mother had tried to negotiate. She spoke their language. She believed in peace. Holt met with her. He smiled. He promised to speak to the cavalry captain to clear up the misunderstanding about the raid." He clenched his fist and the small horse creaked. It was a lie. He was stalling. He was pinpointing our location for the attack. He set us up. He turned to her, and his face was no longer the cold mask of the chief. It was the face of the boy who had survived the fire. The scars seemed to stand out stark and white against his skin. "But the real scar," he said, and his voice broke just for a second. "The one that—" He stopped, unable to continue. Matilda stood and walked toward him, her fear for him and of him long gone. "Kaelin, what is it?" "I was young," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I was 15. I thought I was a warrior. When my mother told me Holt had promised peace, I called her a fool. I told her he was a snake. I had found a pass, a high pass through the western mesa. I told her I could get our family, the elders and the children out, that I could lead them to safety, while the warriors stayed to fight." He was shaking. A man who seemed carved from stone was trembling with a guilt he had buried for 20 years. "My mother. She trusted me. She argued with the elders, convinced them my plan was better. To run. So we left. I led them. My mother. My little sister. 10 others. I led them right into the pass." He closed his eyes. "Holt had soldiers waiting. It was a box canyon, an ambush. He hadn't just pinpointed our camp. He had anticipated we would run. He had sealed the only escape. He had used my arrogance, my pride against me. I didn't save them, Matilda. I led them to the slaughter. He slammed his fist against the stone mantel. I woke up by the river. Burned. Alive. Everyone else. He choked on the word. Gone. My sister. She had this. He held up the small wooden horse. I killed them. Holt pulled the trigger, but I aimed the gun. This land, this ranch, I built it on their graves. I built it to be strong enough so no one could ever take anything from me again. And I have lived with that coldness, that guilt, every single day. This was the hidden scar. Not the fire on his face, but the fire in his memory. The guilt that had frozen his heart turned him into a man of cold, hard justice, because he could never forgive himself for the one time he had been young, arrogant, and wrong. Matilda didn't think. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid, a coiled spring of pain. "You were a child," she said, her voice fierce. "You were a boy trying to save his family. You didn't kill them. Holt did. He didn't use your pride, Kaelin. He used his own cruelty. He used his deceit. That is not on you. It has never been on you." He looked at her, his dark eyes wide, swimming with an agony she had never seen. He was listening, really listening. Her words were sinking past the ice, touching the wound he had kept buried. "You honor them," she said, her grip tightening on his arm. "You honor them by living, by building this place, by protecting the people who are here now, by protecting Ben. You are not a killer. You are a survivor. And you are a mender, just like your mother. You forgot how to be." He stared at her, breathing hard. He didn't pull away. He slowly, agonizingly uncurled his fist from the small toy horse. He didn't speak, but his eyes, the frozen sea in his eyes had finally, after 2 decades, begun to break. Her kindness, her insistence on his innocence, was the one thing he had never had. It was the one thing he couldn't fight. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then, very slowly, he covered her hand with his own. It was the first time he had ever touched her. It was not the touch of a master or a boss. It was the touch of a man reaching for an anchor in a storm. And Matilda, his indentured servant, his ledger girl, didn't pull away. She held on. The reckoning came as Kaelin knew it would at dawn. A rider from the North Ridge came galloping in, his horse lathered. "Holt!" the man yelled, sliding from the saddle. "He's coming. He's got a posse, at least 20 men. And he's got warrants. Warrants for your arrest, boss, for rustling. He's framing me," Kaelin said, his voice calm. He turned to Donovan. "You know the plan. Get the men to the high rocks. They'll have the advantage there. No one fires until I say." "And you, boss?" Donovan asked. "I'll be in the house." Kaelin looked at Matilda. "Holt doesn't just want the land. He wants me. And now, he wants her." "I'm not leaving you," Matilda said, her voice set. "You're not," Kaelin agreed. "You're my witness, and you're my bargaining chip." He hated the words, but they were true. The posse thundered into the basin an hour later. Holt was at their head, his deputy's badge shining. He held up the warrant. "Kaelin Blackwater, by the authority of the Arizona Territory, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle-rustling conspiracy and resisting a lawful authority." Kaelin stepped onto the porch. He was unarmed. "You're a liar and a thief, Gideon. Your paper means nothing here. It means I get to hang you." Holt snarled, his charm gone, replaced by raw hatred. "And take this cursed land. Men search the house. Find him." "I'm right here," Kaelin said. It was a trap. As Holt's men dismounted and started for the house, Donovan's men opened fire from the rocks above. The posse scattered chaos erupting in the courtyard. Men shouted, horses screamed. Holt, furious, saw his plan falling apart. His eyes darted to the house, and he saw Matilda standing in the doorway behind Kalen. "You!" Holt roared. He spurred his horse, jumping it onto the porch, a feat of mad horsemanship. He grabbed Matilda by the arm, dragging her from the house and slinging her across his saddle. "Cease fire! Cease fire, or the girl dies!" Kalen froze. It was happening again. The sight of Matilda struggling against the man who had murdered his family broke the cold calm. The past and present collided. He saw his sister, his mother, being dragged away. No, Kalen roared, a sound of pure primal rage. He launched himself from the porch, grabbing the bridle of Holt's rearing horse, his strength inhuman. The horse toppled, sending Holt and Matilda crashing to the ground. Holt scrambled up, drawing his revolver. Kalen was on him. It wasn't a gunfight, it was a brawl. Kalen, fueled by 20 years of suppressed grief and rage, slammed his fist into Holt's face. Holt went down. Kalen was on top of him, his hands closing around the deputy's throat. The scar on Kalen's face was livid. His eyes were not cold, they were burning. He was the boy from the fire again, and he was going to kill this man. "Kalen." He heard her voice, but it was distant. "Kalen, don't!" Matilda screamed, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed his arm, the one he had raised, to strike a final fatal blow. "Don't, not like this. Not for revenge." He paused, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on Holt's terrified, gasping face. "For justice," Matilda pleaded, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. "Remember your mother. The language of mending. Don't become him. Don't become the fire." Her words cut through the red haze. The language of mending. He looked at Holt, then at Matilda. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the belief. The belief in him. He let go. He stood up, breathing hard, pulling Holt to his feet. By now, Donovan and the other men had surrounded the remnants of the posse who had thrown down their guns. Kalen took the rope from Holt's own saddle. "You won't hang Gideon," Kalen said, his voice ragged but controlled. "You'll stand trial. Not here. In Santa Fe. I sent the proof." Holt's eyes widened. "The draft. The telegraph. Wasn't just a payroll," Matilda said, standing beside Kalen. "It was a copy of my report, sent to the territorial marshal." Kalen looked at Donovan. "Tie him up. Him and his posse. They're going to prison for a long, long time." As Donovan roughly bound Holt's hands, Holt stared at Kalen with pure venom. "You think this is over, savage? You're still just a half-breed hiding in the rocks, and she's still just your slave." Kalen walked over to Holt. He didn't hit him. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was the indenture contract. He held it up for Holt to see. Then, very deliberately, he tore it into pieces. "She is not a slave." Kalen Blackwater said, his voice clear and ringing across the courtyard. "She is the mistress of the Blackwater Divide." He turned his back on the sputtering, defeated Holt and walked to Matilda. He stood in front of her, his hands, his face, his clothes covered in the dust of the fight. He was no longer the cold chief. He was just Kalen. He gently, hesitantly reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "It's over, Matilda," he said, his voice rough. "It's over." She didn't flinch from his touch. She leaned into it. The long, screaming wind of the high plains finally seemed to settle into a whisper. The aftermath was quiet. The territorial marshals acting on Matilda's telegraphed report arrived 2 days later. They were not pleased to find a deputy and his posse tied up. But the evidence was irrefutable. Kalen's ledgers, Matilda's meticulous notes, and the testimony of the bank teller in Santa Fe painted a perfect picture of Gideon Holt's long-running criminal enterprise. Holt and his men were taken away in chains, his reign of corruption finally over. With Holt gone, A strange peace settled over the Blackwater Divide. The debt was gone, torn to pieces, and scattered on the wind. Matilda Grant was, for the first time in nearly a year, a free woman. And she had never felt more lost. She packed her single bag in the small, cold room that had been her first homes here. She folded the simple coarse dresses Mrs. Price had given her. Where would she go back east, to a life she no longer recognized, a world of soft hands and quiet parlors that now seemed as alien as the moon? There was a knock on her door. It was Caelan. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling it. He looked awkward, hesitant. This was a man who commanded a dozen hard men who had faced down a corrupt lawman, and he was struggling to find words. "You are packing," he observed flatly. "Yes," Matilda said, her voice small. "The indenture is... I am free to go." "Yes," he said. He looked at her bag, then back at her. "Holt is gone. The land is safe. The business, it is strong. Because of you." "I was just balancing the books," she said, looking down. "No," he said, stepping into the room. "You were not. You gave a boy back his leg. You gave this ranch back its integrity. And you gave me back." He trailed off, touching the scar on his face. "You reminded me of a language I had forgotten." He took a breath. "I came to tell you that I have arranged for a wagon and escort. It will take you to Santa Fe. From there, I have arranged for a bank draft. Enough to buy you a new life. Back east. Wherever you wish." This was it. Freedom. Everything she had wanted. It felt like ash in her mouth. "Thank you, Caelan," she whispered. "That is very generous." He nodded, his face impassive, but his eyes were a storm of unspoken emotion. He turned to leave. "Caelan, wait," she said. He stopped. "What if I don't want to go?" He turned back to her slowly. "This is a hard place, Matilda. It is a life of dust and wind. It is not the world you were born to. The world I was born to sold me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The world I was born to is full of men like my father and men like Gideon Holt. This world is hard, yes, but it's real. The justice is real. The loyalty is real." She looked up at him. "I don't know how to do this, but I have nowhere else to go, and I do not wish to." Caelan studied her face, searching as he had that first day in his office. But this time he wasn't looking for lies. He was looking for the truth. I do not want you as a servant," he said, his voice rough. "And I would not have you as anything less than my equal. I am not your equal, Caelan," she said. "You are a chief, a leader. And you," he said, taking a step closer, "are a mender. You are the mistress of the Blackwater Divide." I said that because it was the truth. He reached out, not to her arm, but to her hand. He took it. His hand was large, warm and calloused from work and from fire. Hers was small, but no longer soft. "Stay, Matilda," he said, his voice low. "Don't stay as my clerk. Don't stay as my captive. Stay as my partner. Help me build this place, not as a fortress, but as a home." Matilda looked at their joined hands. She thought of the fear she'd felt, the hatred, the pity, the respect. And now this, a quiet, powerful feeling that felt as solid and real as the mesas around them. She curled her fingers, linking them with his. "I'll stay," she said. He did not smile. His face did not change. But his eyes, the coldness was gone. Completely. In its place was a warmth that was brighter and more powerful than any fire. She did not leave. She moved from the small, cold room into the main house. She didn't just balance Caelan's ledgers. She helped him run the ranch, her sharp mind, a perfect balance to his deep knowledge of the land. The men called her Mom, but they treated her like a queen. And Kalen Blackwater, the cold Apache chief, was no longer cold. He was still quiet, still scarred. But when he looked at her, he was healed. This was a story of a debt paid in a currency no one expected kindness. Matilda was sent to pay for her father's mistakes, trapped by a man frozen by his own tragic past. But she refused to be a victim. She saw the man behind the scars, the pain behind the coldness, and with her unwavering integrity, she didn't just balance his books, she balanced his soul. She proved that true strength isn't about building walls, but about having the courage to tear them down. They both found their reckoning not in revenge, but in justice, and built a future not on a contract, but on a partnership. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you were moved by Matilda's journey and Kalen's redemption, please help our channel grow. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of twists and justice, and most importantly, subscribe for more real-life drama every week. We appreciate every single one of you.